Okay, thank you everybody. So we're going to be talking about sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, in this session. Something that's been in the news a lot over the past 12 months and is only increasingly in the headlines, it seems. Now, regular readers of Sustainability magazine or previous attendees at one of our shows may recall that we first had a panel discussion about this very topic, sustainable aviation fuel, back in 2022. And it was a great session. There was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of audience engagement. That's a hint, by the way. And it was one of the best sessions, I think, of the show that year. So it seemed foolish not to revisit this topic, especially seeing the amount of attention it's garnering at the moment. Now, as I said, it's really grabbing the headlines, but it's also grabbing the aviation agenda as well. So you've even got countries around the world announcing mandates, such as Singapore, for instance, from 2026. Then every flight that departs Singapore has to use a proportion of sustainable aviation fuel. I'm sure you could probably give us the actual stats on that. But it's here, it's available, it works, and so it is going to be implemented into aircraft and into engines, and it will be mandated around the world. And that's really important because, as we discussed at the previous session, we do have an issue. Call it a problem, maybe. I think last time we called it the elephant in the room. Aviation does emit, and aviation is also growing at quite a rate. It's not going away. And so the best way of tackling those emissions and mitigating those emissions is by using more sustainable aviation fuel. That's one of the solutions. So that's why I'm joined today by two speakers, as you can see, one from ING and one from Nesta, who are showing real leadership in how to tackle aviation emissions with SAF. So joining me are Hugo Canters of INF and Suzanne Baumer of Nesta. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves because you want to listen to them, you don't want to listen to me. So Hugo, why don't you tell us about your role at ING and obviously explain to anyone who might not know who ING are.
Okay, so my name is Hugo. I've been with ING for a very, very long time. In fact, I started last century, I need to realize. I'm a managing director, worked at different locations across the globe for ING, currently based in Frankfurt. I have sort of two roles, if you like. I head up the transport and logistics sector team in Frankfurt, which includes aviation, but also carbon-intensive sectors, decarbonization sectors, such as automotive and shipping. Also includes, for instance, rail. I have a number of rail finance professionals, where the sustainability discussion is, of course, much easier than it is in aviation. So I also have a sort of a broader overview on, let's say, the transport and logistics sector. The second role I have is I am the global head for aviation. So everything we do, sector-wise, globally for aviation, is what I'm being held responsible for. If I made a third role, which is sort of I do want to mention, I'm also an initiator and founder and board member of an organization called Impact, which brings together a number of leading international aviation finance banks, scientists, law firms, the likes of Ernst & Young and what have you, to set the standards for what would be a sustainable aviation finance. What does sustainability really mean? It currently has 40 members, and I'm really proud also to fulfill that role, but that's a Prodeo role.
And Suzanne.
Yeah, pleasure to be back, Scott. Really nice to see so many of you here in the room and also so many online, I know. Really great to be back again. My name is Suzanne Baumer. I head up partnerships and programs at Nesta. And for those of you who don't know, Nesta is a humble Finnish company, but with great ambitions. And we are the leader and world's largest producer of sustainable aviation fuel. And in my role, I'm responsible for helping really accelerate that path. I mean, as Scott outlined, we have the solutions, and it's now about making them work and implementing them. And although awareness and uptake might still need a bit of a push, we need to get going. And that's really where the partnerships in all its different forms come into play. So that's me. I've always worked in sustainability and trying to accelerate that now in my role at Neste.
Okay, perfect. So this is the problem, and it's an urgent problem. The world clearly needs immediate solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And while the aviation industry contributes to those global emissions, it also plays a significant role and a growing role in our daily lives and global connectivity. We can't live without aviation, I would argue. And although individuals and corporates should absolutely try to reduce their flying, and again, there's lots of regulations coming in there to reduce certain types of flying or certain journeys, we do see that the aviation industry is still set to grow exponentially in the coming years ahead. So that's the problem. Suzanne, talk us through it. How do we tackle it?
Yeah, maybe first a question to the audience, because you're asking us a lot of questions, but I think it's also nice to hear from you. Who flies, whether for leisure or work? Raise of hands, yeah. And I don't think COVID made any change to that. Maybe we stopped for a little while, but we are ultimately an interconnected world, whether through our relatives, friends, but also definitely for business, as we can all see that we're here today. So the problem is real, and as you've said, I mean, aviation continues to grow, and there's still a lot of areas that are now getting onto a plane. So we need solutions, and very urgently so.
Absolutely. And Hugo, from your perspective as well, how is ING tackling this? What do you need to do as an organisation?
A lot. Maybe following on the question to your question, to the audience, do you have any idea what percentage of the world population, it's around 7 billion people, I didn't check, but I heard it's about 7 billion people, what percentage of the world population has ever been on an airplane, commercial airplane? Once or more? Is it more than 35% or less? Less? Okay. The answer is roughly that about 20% of the world population, only 20% of the world population has ever flown. The world hasn't started flying yet. It's a century-old industry. KLM, Qantas have celebrated their centennial, so 100-year-old airlines, 102, 103 years old. And before Corona, before COVID, which of course was a massive dent to the sector, the industry was growing 6-7% every year. Not so much in Europe, not so much in the US, that is fairly saturated. It's particularly Asia that has not started to fly. Estimates are about 150 million people are first-time flyers every year, just to put things in perspective. You were saying we're not going anywhere. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it is a global sector, and the world hasn't, just by the sheer numbers, hasn't started to fly. Long introduction. What do? A lot. We measure the carbon intensity of the aviation finance portfolio, and that is banker speak for the things we finance in the sector. We measure that. We were the very first bank to report that also publicly. I think we did so in 2018 and do so every year. And we measure it also against a Paris Climate Agreement pathway, and we publish the results, whether they are good or bad, but we do. So it's also being true to yourself. If you don't measure, you don't know what's going on. And if you set yourself targets, you do need to measure. I can talk about this for a very long time, but I'll stop here.
Okay, yeah, we do have a limited number of time. Okay, so Suzanne, let's talk more about the role of sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF. What role can that play to help air travel-related emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, Neste has been leading the change towards renewables. Quite a long time ago, we decided that there's a need for a transition. So we've been producing, supplying sustainable aviation fuel since 2011, and that feels like a lifetime ago, and it was, because at that time it was not that normal to think and do renewables. So just casting our minds back to that time, we've really come a long way. Are we there yet? No, not at all. But are we on the right track? Definitely. So what we at Neste are doing is, of course, taking our responsibility and ramping up our capacity to produce sustainable aviation fuel. We did so 15-folding our capacity between 2022 and roughly this year. And we need the rest of the industry, but also more importantly, consumers to get on board and accepting that this is really the new way that we're going to go about our travel. Some interesting data that I picked up yesterday at another event is that apparently consumers did make changes in their buying behavior, but where did they not make any changes? In how they go about choosing their travel. And why that is, I don't know right now, but I think it's important to recognize that a trip is not just a trip. There's an impact to that trip. There's a emission footprint to that trip. And obviously we can solve that by introducing a fuel that's not a fossil fuel that creates the impact that we're currently seeing in the sector today.
And just to explain to people as well, the sustainable aviation fuel we're talking about here, nothing needs to happen to the aircraft or the engines that are currently flying on virtually every single plane around the world. This is completely compatible and it works right now.
Yeah, maybe some quick facts. So as of today, the safety regulations in the aviation sector allow for up to 50% blending of sustainable aviation fuel into the fuel mix. And that's great because this means we don't need any separate tanks, any separate storage, any separate infrastructure, which means it's a solution that indeed has been in use for quite some time without needing any additional investments. Now we hope, of course, one day that we will be able to move to 100% SAF usage. There have been, for those of you that follow the news on this topic, have been some test flights already, and those look very promising going forward. But let's first get on to the adoption and acceptance, and then, of course, we can get to the 100% flights. Maybe what else I can add is if we think about the process or the recipe for sustainable aviation fuel, it's important to remember that at the moment we're working on using waste and residue streams, so used cooking oil and animal waste fats. That will not help the entire world fly. We recognize that. So at the same time, we need to continue looking for other pathways that will help us to ensure that we have alternatives to replacing the fossil fuels that we currently heavily rely on.
And I think you mentioned, just to pull up on this, did you say that the production of SAF from Neste has gone up 50-fold?
15
15-fold, okay, since 2022, which is still significant. How much more do we need?
Quite a lot. I mean, currently, I think pre-COVID, at least, the estimate was that we consume roughly 300 million tons of jet fuel per year. And as of today, roughly 1% or a little over it of that is sustainable aviation fuel. So you can do the math that we still have quite a way to go. But I don't want us to land necessarily in the doomsday. We're only at 1%. I think the encouraging part is where we've gotten to between, let's say, 15 years ago and today, that we are already at 1%. And of course, it's hugely important that we continue to support the ramp up and growth of the industry to ensure that we can move this up to double digits very soon.
Yeah. So how does SAF actually reduce emissions then? Let's say that I don't know anything about it, which frankly I don't. How does it actually reduce the emissions?
Yeah, I can go back to the ingredients to keep it simple.
Yeah.
By ensuring that we don't have to pump up new fossil fuel to produce the sustainable aviation fuel. We're keeping those underground. And what we make use of is the oils and fats or waste streams that are already on the earth, and hence, ensuring that over the life cycle of the fuel, which of course also needs a production process and transportation, so we factor that in, it can reduce up to 80% of emissions compared to the regular fossil fuel.
Well, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, let's start.
Okay, Hugo, going to bring you back in here as well. So explain to us why obviously using SAF is important to ING and how you're using it.
I'm going to try to answer that question twofold, because on the one hand I can look at it from a sector perspective, but at the same time I work for a global bank, 60,000 people active in 40 countries, and as such, and not everybody is business traveling or on a plane, but we have our own corporate footprint as well. I think the point is indeed that if we want to decarbonize this sector and go on the trajectory where we do it a little bit better every year, as you were saying, and as we should be taking the opportunity, this is very much also for ING practicing what you preach. If we want to be, and I think we are a leader in the sustainability, in thinking and financing the transitions, finding the right clients that have transition pathways that are committed and so on, then the question is also, what do you do yourself and what can you do yourself? So we do purchase substantial amounts of sustainable aviation fuel for our own corporate business travel. So that is, as you said as well, something we can start doing right now. So that's an important one. If I look at it from a sector perspective, there is not a whole lot of alternative. The aircraft that are being produced right now will be flying for another 25 years. And I will certainly not, I don't like pessimism either, I think this sector will decarbonize. However, there is no magic trick where all of a sudden, for instance, as we see, for instance, in the automotive sector, where you see a lot of electrification and what have you, now that also takes time in and on itself. But there is a sort of a pathway and a technology available. On the aviation sector, that is not on the imminent horizon. That will take a number of years. Don't ask me when, but I would say probably 10 years from now before we have different propulsion types which are more sustainable. And that also means that even if they are there, if you want exact numbers, talk to Boeing or Airbus, they know this better than I do, but it's going to take a long time. And even if they are there, you cannot replace the global aircraft fleet just instantly, just by sheer statistics you can't. So we'll be dealing with the airplanes that are flying around right now. So if you want to decarbonize, you'll have to a large extent, there's some other ways to do it as well, and some other meaningful things we could do. Sustainable aviation fuel is going to be the key.
Okay, now a lot of people watching this in the room, watching it on demand or watching the live stream now are executives from big organisations, big corporates around the world, and they are also trying to do similar to ING, right, which is to decarbonise their own efforts and their own travel. Now, Suzanne, you've launched something recently, I believe, which is the Nesta Impact. Could you explain what that is and how that's helping corporates with this?
Yeah, sure, Scott. As we've heard, and probably also today, there's a lot of talk about, tackling your scope 3 is complicated, it's difficult, and we've heard that, and we've heard that for some time now. Having been around the sustainability world for quite a bit, it's not the first year that I'm hearing it. So how do you bridge then that gap in the willingness and ambition, as we've seen from ING, but also many others, to start reducing your emissions today? How do you make that accessible when we know that also not everyone owns an aircraft where they can then replace this fuel? So what we worked on for quite a while now is to make this solution very simple, very accessible, and very easy to adopt for anyone who has a problem with making their aviation footprint smaller and hence starting to reduce some of their footprint. So Nesta Impact is about reducing your emissions and making that simple and easy. What is needed is a target. How much do you want to reduce your footprint? We will introduce the amount of SAF into the ecosystem, and then there's a report that can be used, of course, because what we find extremely important is credibility, traceability, and transparency, as I think the previous session also outlined as such a hunger for data, and that's really good, but it should also not stop us. Making sure that we meet the needs of the organizations that are willing to take action today.
So let's say I'm a chief sustainability officer of a large multinational company, and I come to you and say, I want to reduce my my aviation carbon emissions by 10%. You can enable that by using a certain amount of SAF. And how can they access that? Is access part of the problem with people not using SAF or being, it's slow to adopt?
I'll answer your two questions. Yes, they can come to us today, tomorrow, this week. I mean, the SAF is rolling out of the refineries. I mean, last year we opened the world's largest sustainable aviation fuel refinery in Singapore. So the availability is covered to an extent. Of course, we still need a lot more of it. And then your other question about what's the problem? Is it access? I would not say it's access. I mean, yes, it might not be your average procurement task to start buying SAF on the marketplace. That might be new, and we know that. That's a journey that many organizations are on and at different stages of. It's largely to do with the awareness, I would say, that how can this solution help you actually start reducing on that journey? So it's more the awareness than the availability of the technology or the product itself, which I know might have been an issue a couple of years ago. It's there, and the solution is there, and now let's start implementing it.
And as with any technology, I imagine that the costs will come down as production ramps up, correct? So at the moment, if people are considering, well, SAF sounds like a nice to have, but if it's going to cost me considerably more, then that might, hold people back as well. But as you're increasing production, that will bring the costs down as well. And then how does that compare to regular aviation fuel?
I like that question. That comes almost at every opportunity. So yes, developing something that's more sustainable than the current is not for free. And yes, we can go to the comparison of current aviation fuel, and if you do it for a like-for-like basis, it's roughly between 3 to 5 times more expensive. But that's not what I want the audience to remember. What I want the audience to remember is that if we go to 2050, where we need to have a net zero industry, it roughly would cost us maybe 18% more on your ticket. And that's ultimately what we need to be working towards, because 3 to 5 times seems like a massive leap, and that sounds then like a nice to have. But that will not get us into action mode. What should get us into action mode is that it might be the cost of a cup of coffee for your small flight from within Europe, or a few $100s in your package holiday to a very far away destination. And then, of course, there are other elements that could develop over time. I mean, can we continue to compare our current way of traveling with fossil fuels versus more sustainable alternatives? Is there also not a cost to that if you factor it in?
Absolutely. So Hugo, you're using Nesta Impact,
Yes.
correct? So talk us through that. Why have you decided to get involved with that? Why using Nesta Impact?
I'm not using it personally. I'm also a consumer of the system, just to be sure. If I may get back to the previous point in terms of cost, it is sustainable aviation fuel it's a matter of scale and what have you, it's probably going to increase the cost of flying. But maybe just 2 remarks. What will be the cost if we don't, long term? Mm-hmm. The other one is increasingly in the EU, but also we're in the UK right now, is sort of participating in a similar scheme. There is a cost to carbon already, and it's increasing. It's called EU ETS, or the UK equivalent of which the name I forgot, to be honest. There is a cost to carbon already. The allotment for that will go down. So at a certain point in time, if you don't pay for your SAF, you'll pay it otherwise. You better pay for SAF, right? So the business case is also really there. Back to your question, why do we use Nesta? Again, it's our own commitment to practice what you preach. If you're having, with your clients, dialogues, particularly in the, energy-intensive or carbon-intensive sectors, which is not only aviation, it can also be shipping, it can also be real estate and what have you. We continuously have a sustainability dialogue with our clients. Why do we do that? It is from a commitment, our own commitment, also to steer our portfolios towards a net zero pathway, which we also measure and publicize. That is in a way, also, it is a conviction that it's the right thing to do. But also, if you like, there is sort of a risk aspect to that as well. Because we believe fundamentally that only those businesses that are willing to transition will be the winners of the future. It's probably relatively easy, I think, for aviation and probably for other sectors as well, not to do anything and not incur the cost, to incur the hassle. But will that business be there in 3, 5, 7, 8 years from now? And that's typically the perspective that we need to have as a bank. So there's also that perspective there, right? So that is what we want to know. And again, you know, if that is the dialogue you continuously have with your clients, what is your transition pathway? It's been validated. What are your issues? How are the reporting standards and so on? And how can we finance the transition as a bank? Because that's our role in society as well, we believe, right? Then you also need to practice what you preach. Now, Neste is a client of ours, apart from Neste Impact, apart from the sustainable aviation fuels, been a long-term relationship. And we admire Neste really because it has come from an entirely fossil-based background and is one of those businesses that says, yes, I do want to transition. It takes courage, it takes vision, first and foremost, it takes capital. But we also believe that Neste, for that reason, just as a client, is one of those businesses that do want to transition, and therefore there is a future, right? So I think that's where the relationship started. Now, we also do, we finance globally in the aviation sector, sustainable aviation fuel, so there's all sorts of, you know, symbiotic relationship on different levels evolving, which is also really, really nice to see, where also, you know, the opportunities that the sustainability topic gives us, because we're having a very different conversation than I think that we would have had 5 or 10 years ago. And that's very good.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I imagine that ING uses multiple airlines for your operations.
We do.
So, do you have the option of buying SAF from those airlines?
Yes, and actually we do.
Right.
You know, there is a certain amount of sustainable aviation fuel that we buy. The number I received yesterday was around 1,500 metric tons. Susan, you can tell me whether that makes sense or not. So that covers a substantial amount of our you know, corporate travel, our own CO2 footprint related to air travel. So we buy that from, amongst others, Neste, but we use Air France KLM. We use Lufthansa, we use Singapore Airlines, and we use last year we added Qantas. It will not be a surprise to you that particularly those airlines are important relationships for me.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So what benefits do you see from the Neste Impact relationship?
Well, particularly the impact, what we struggle with, and I think that is probably with, you know, this esteemed audience here and online, is, you know, also how do we account for our CO2 reductions? Mm-hmm. What are the standards? What does CO2, E, etc. mean? It's a very good thing, and I encourage everybody, you know, practice what you preach. If there is corporate air travel, buy sustainable aviation fuel. That's the right thing to do. If you want to start small, fine, but increase, as ING also does. We have the ambition to increase our commitment every year, that's fine. But when I spoke with our sustainability guy responsible for this program and asked him what is the CO2E impact, the answer was, well, we've published a number 2022, but now with 2023, if we look at 2023, we're not entirely sure whether we should publish this as a listed company, also, you know, with all the scrutiny around sustainability, because of what is our reporting standards, what are the accounting standards, how do we actually measure this? That's, I think, where probably all of you also need a bit of help, including ourselves. And I think that's also where Neste wants to, you know, help their clients to do that properly. So that's also a big benefit to us.
Yeah, of course. Now, we're just going to close off the session now. So let's just look at some key takeaways for our audience here. Starting with you, Suzanne, what's the key message you'd like to get across to people watching today?
Yeah. I would say a few. I mean, first of all, the solutions are there. It may have seemed complex and impossible, but we are here today. The technology is there, the availability is there, and also for sure the the uptake and the ability to now take advantage of this. The other part is let's indeed be optimistic that we have done energy transitions before as a planet, as a society, and this is just the next one that we're embarking on, and that's one that we can only do if we're doing it collectively. So I'm really pleased that we're here today with ING, but I know we're doing this together with many other partners in different parts of the sector that are really leading and having ambitious targets to start moving and reducing their emissions, together with the support of the technology and the fuel that Neste, of course, brings in. And important, maybe last point is credibility, transparency are super important. Of course, if we don't keep that as the highest standard, we will not go anywhere. It's so important that, of course, you're able to make the type of claims that you want to make about the reductions you've achieved as an organization in a credible way, and that's what we're supporting.
And Hugo, final thoughts from you?
How many do you want? A few things. I'll keep it short. Suzanne spoke about credibility, and that is a really, really important one. I think, the whole sustainability discussion and the green financing, and I'm going to take this discussion a little bit as a banker, I think we'll look back at this period as, saying, oh, that was really in its infancy. I see a lot of good initiatives, whether they're really green or measurably sustainable, whether it's transparency, whether it's really, based upon rigorous, indisputable data, I think is sometimes arguable. I'm not taking away any of the good intentions behind it, but I think that is really going to be the key as well. It is about data, reporting standards and integrity in terms of what really is sustainable. As I just said, we struggle with the CO2e equivalent number for our sustainable aviation final procurement. That will be resolved. I'm sure there will be standards also with the help of Neste and others, but it doesn't stop you from doing the right thing. Let's do it.
And there's nothing stopping anyone from walking out of this room and switching to SAF tomorrow, correct?
Yes.
Very much so.
Okay, well there's the gauntlet then that's been thrown down. If you're not already using SAF, it's there, it's available, it works, and there's no excuse for not doing it. Correct?
Very correct, yes.
Very good.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you to Suzanne and to Hugo. Thank you.
Thank you.